Okay, we are getting ready to move towards action, y'all. And one of the critical steps for moving toward action is our part of our framework called Deconstruct It. And so you've probably been wondering, what do we mean by deconstruction anyway? And so we're going to dig into what that actually means here. Again, we're not making the case for DEI. You all already know this, but one thing that we know for sure is that diversity cannot exist in inequitable and exclusionary environments. Without equity and inclusion, your workplace is kind of like a bucket with holes in it and holes of inequity and exclusion. And you pour diversity in, and the patterns of oppression that lead to inequity and exclusion uh, cause that diversity to drip out of the holes in your bucket. Acknowledging these patterns of oppression is a critical first step. And we've been working on that in our See It part of our framework. We also need to take a microscope to the ways of our working to see what might be getting in our way as we're thinking about finding a new way of being. And so we can illuminate that by looking at what we call the employee life cycle. This employee life cycle represents all the practices and processes an employee might experience as they work at an organization. What you're seeing on the screen are just some examples of these practices on this employee life cycle. There could be more items on here for sure, but this just shows you some of the traditional ways that we typically work, often lead to some inequity. So, if our traditional ways of working and doing things were created to support a homogenous team, then when we diversify, some of our traditional ways of working can lead to some patterns that can get in our way. And we've been exploring that in the last few months. And so I'm going to highlight three of these and how they show up specifically under hiring. Often, what we find is that when we hire for a role, we share that role with our network, and we might give people in our network some insider information, like about the hiring manager, how the hiring process works. We might coach them on the hiring process. And when you diversify, those people outside of your networks don't have access to that information. And so then you end up with different hiring outcomes because of that. Another example is inconsistent feedback due to racial anxiety. So we've talked about this phenomena of racial anxiety when we're working across lines of race. We can feel anxious about causing harm or experiencing harm, and it makes us hold back. And what this means is that a lot of times people don't give feedback to people of color and women because of that anxiety. A third example is racial stereotype. The way that we view performance is shaped by people's race. So you all have read the study that talked about how there was an example where there was a cover letter and they planted mistakes in it. And they made one version of the cover letter seem like it was a white man's cover letter, and the other version looked like a Black man's cover letter. When they looked at the white man's cover letter, they found about 40% of the mistakes. When they looked at the Black person's cover letter, they found about 80% of the mistakes. The performance was the same, but the way that they assessed the performance was shaped by race. So these are some of the ways that our traditional ways of doing things can lead to inequity. So now we're going to talk about the Deconstruct It part of our framework. So if you remember, See It is learning to see those patterns of oppression that show up in our workplaces. The last few weeks have been really focused on that. Deconstruct It is where we are pulling apart these processes and finding the ways that inequity might be creeping in so that we can think about how we might create something new. So now we're going to look at a specific example. So let's look at pay and applying this framework. So pay, to see it, you might do an analysis of pay across the organization and identify where you see differences along lines of race and gender, meaning that women are paid less than men for the same level of work, or people of color are paid less than white people for the same level of work. I've actually experienced that and seen that at work. To deconstruct it, what you would want to do is outline the steps to determine pay. So, at a high level, a lot of organizations ask candidates for their salary range, and then the manager decides the salary for each hire, anchoring on what the person tells them they want to make for the role. And then you identify practices and mindsets that are contributing to the inequity. And here, women and people of color are systemically paid less in our society than men and white people. So when you ask candidates for a salary range, you are then anchoring on that range and you perpetuate a societal inequity and embed that into the organizational pay practices. You can also have your own manager individual biases lead to inconsistency and inequity in organizational pay, right? We just talked about these examples where the performance is the same, but we view it differently because of race or gender. And if that is true, you might set salary lower for women and people of color. And when we look across the different ways that people are paid, what we see is that is true. In fact, Black Women's Equal Pay Day is in August, meaning that Black women have to work a year and 7 months and some change to earn the same amount of money that a white man would earn on average in 1 year. So this is definitely showing up in our pay practices. To co-create it, you would come up with new ways of being. That might be posting rules with a salary range to increase salary transparency and disrupt patterns of underpaying women and people of color. Using consistent processes to set salaries, gather input from your team on processes and the philosophy, and regularly analyzing pay across the organization. When you see an inequity, recalibrate immediately to ensure that women and people of color are paid equitably. That's just an example of how you might deconstruct a process. Up next, in our live session, we're going to practice applying the framework to 2 case studies so that you can see how we actually are deconstructing it. And this will set you up for success for the upcoming weeks as you begin to deconstruct your own work practices at work. We're going to look into 6 of them over the next 2 weeks after this week, and you'll get to apply the framework and see how you can create something new. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in the live session.